New evidence makes the possibility of violent conflict between Homo sapiens and Neanderthal women increasingly difficult to dismiss. At Goyette Cave in Belgium, researchers identified a strikingly selective group of cannibalized Neanderthals, 4 adult or adolescent females and 2 male children who were butchered around 45,000 years ago, during the period when modern humans were entering northern Europe. Although the perpetrators remain unidentified, the researchers acknowledge that intergroup conflict may have contributed to the accumulation. At Saint-Césaire, a late Neanderthal, often interpreted as female, survived a deliberate blow to the skull at roughly the time modern humans were spreading through France, though neither the attacker's identity nor the individual's sex is certain. These discoveries do not prove that Homo sapiens systematically killed Neanderthal women, but they establish that violence occurred during the critical period of contact and that females may sometimes have been selectively targeted. This possibility becomes more significant in light of a recent genetic study indicating that interbreeding disproportionately involved Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females. Taken together, the evidence raises a disturbing hypothesis. Expanding sapiens populations may have eliminated or displaced Neanderthal women while absorbing Neanderthal ancestry primarily through the surviving males. A process of sex-biased assimilation that could have destroyed the Neanderthals as a distinct population without erasing their DNA from humanity. 6 Neanderthal women entered the third cavern at Goyat in Belgium between roughly 45,000 and 41,000 years ago. But they did not enter the archaeological story as 6 ordinary members of a dying population. Their bones were broken, stripped of flesh, opened for marrow, and mixed among the butchered bodies of animals. Several fragments were later handled as tools. At first, this looked like another grim example of Neanderthals eating the dead, a practice already recognized at scattered European sites. New research, however, exposed a far stranger pattern. 4 of the 6 individuals were adult or adolescent women, while the other 2 were children or adolescents. The women were unusually short and lightly built, and chemical signatures inside their bones indicated that they came from somewhere beyond the immediate region. These were not simply local Neanderthals who died together during hunger, they were outsiders, and their selection forces us to confront a possibility that the familiar extinction story rarely considers. Near the end of the Neanderthal world, women and children from one community became targeted prey, while a different trail in ancient DNA indicates that Neanderthal men entered the ancestry of expanding Homo sapiens groups. The 2 discoveries point in opposite directions. Neanderthal women disappear into broken bone, while Neanderthal men continue through mixed children. That contrast opens a disturbing question. Was the replacement of Neanderthals also a sex-biased struggle in which women were eliminated, displaced, or denied descendants, while men were absorbed into a new human population? The standard account offers a cleaner transition. Homo sapiens entered Europe, bringing larger networks, flexible technology, and expanding populations. Neanderthals, already thinly distributed across an unstable Ice Age landscape, gradually lost territory and vanished by around 40,000 years ago. Interbreeding softened that replacement, leaving people outside Africa with a small fraction of Neanderthal ancestry. In this version, demographic competition works almost impersonally. One population expands while another contracts, and genes pass across the boundary before the older population fades away. Out of Africa, theorists often frame this as a meeting between 2 recognizable populations whose eventual outcome can be tracked through fossils, stone industries, and surviving DNA. Yet none of those forms of evidence identifies the political loyalties of mixed families, the fate of captured outsiders, or the daily structure of communities living along a shifting frontier. A stone point cannot tell us whether its maker had a Neanderthal father. A skeleton classified as Homo sapiens cannot reveal which community raised that person without cultural context. Surviving ancestry cannot tell us how many mixed populations vanished without descendants. Once these limitations are taken seriously, the replacement stops looking like a simple encounter between 2 stable biological camps. It becomes a landscape filled with local Neanderthal groups, incoming Homo sapiens bands, mixed families, temporary alliances, hostile coalitions, and communities carrying different proportions of both ancestries. Goyette fits this fractured landscape better than it fits a peaceful transfer of territory. The third cavern yielded the largest collection of Neanderthal bones in northern Europe, with clear marks from human processing. Cut marks show removal of flesh, broken shafts indicate access to marrow, and the treatment parallels animal butchery at the site. Yet the demographic pattern carries greater significance than the processing alone. 4 adult or adolescent women dominate a group that also contains 2 younger individuals. Their bodies were lighter and shorter than comparative Neanderthal women, and isotopes identify them as non-local. Researchers therefore describe them as selected outsiders and interpreted the episode as exo-cannibalism linked to territoriality, intergroup conflict, or a special fate imposed upon strangers. The crucial uncertainty concerns the identity of the people who ate them. Another Neanderthal community could have attacked these outsiders. An early Homo sapiens group could have encountered and killed them. A mixed community, biologically connected to both populations but politically loyal to neither category, could also stand behind the episode. Archaeology cannot currently choose among those alternatives, but every option undermines the image of one unified Neanderthal population quietly yielding to a unified Homo sapiens population. The timing strengthens that interpretation. Goyette falls within the interval when Homo sapiens groups had entered Central and Northern Europe, with sapiens at Ranis in Germany roughly 400 miles to the east. Archaeologists have not yet demonstrated direct local overlap between those newcomers and the Goyette Neanderthals, and radiocarbon uncertainty still complicates the sequence. Even so, Northern Europe had become a zone of rapid population change. Neanderthal traditions varied from region to region, new tool complexes appeared, and different human communities moved through the same broad ecological corridors. The Linkombian-Ranesian-Yersmanovichian complex, often connected with early Homo sapiens, has a tenuous trace at Goyette. That connection cannot identify the killers, but it places the site inside a wider transition rather than an isolated episode deep in Neanderthal prehistory. Earlier French sites, such as Moulins-Guercy, prove that Neanderthals processed and consumed other Neanderthals long before the final replacement, so eating the dead cannot automatically be assigned to Homo sapiens. The difference at Goyette lies in its late date, its non-local victims, and its selective concentration of women and younger individuals. Together, those details transform an old behavior into possible evidence of intensified frontier competition. Ancient genetics now adds a second pattern that makes the sex of the Goyette victims harder to dismiss. A recent analysis of ancestry on the X chromosome found that interbreeding between the populations was strongly biased. The genetic pattern fits unions occurring predominantly between Neanderthal fathers and Homo sapiens mothers. Modern human genomes carry relatively little Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome, while Neanderthal genomes contain a striking excess of Homo sapiens ancestry there. Natural selection and population structure still complicate the inference, but the combined direction points toward a repeated social asymmetry rather than random mating between equal populations. This matters because mitochondrial DNA passes through mothers. A child born to a Homo sapiens woman and a Neanderthal man carried the mother's mitochondrial lineage while inheriting roughly half of the father's nuclear ancestry. If that child entered an expanding Homo sapiens community, Neanderthal ancestry survived, but a Neanderthal maternal line did not. Across many generations, this process could preserve fragments of Neanderthal fathers while erasing Neanderthal mothers from the ancestry of later people. When the partial Neanderthal skeleton known as Saint-Césaire was uncovered at La Roche-à-Pierrot in western France in 1979, it immediately complicated the accepted story of Europe's last Neanderthals. The young adult, often nicknamed Pierrette and frequently interpreted as female, possessed unmistakably Neanderthal anatomy, yet the bones reportedly came from a layer containing Châtelperronian stone tools. This industry included carefully shaped blades, backed knives, and other elements associated with the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic. Its sophistication once encouraged researchers to attribute it to incoming Homo sapiens. Saint-Césaire appeared to demonstrate that late Neanderthals also manufactured or acquired this technology during the turbulent interval when newly arriving populations were entering Western Europe. The skull supplied an even darker insight into this period. Computerized tomography and virtual reconstruction revealed a healed fracture on the right side of the cranial vault. The injury measured several centimeters and had been created by the impact of a sharp implement. Its position and form were difficult to explain as an accidental fall or damage after burial. Forensic analysis instead indicated a directed strike from a weapon probably delivered during interpersonal conflict. The attacker apparently faced Saint-Césaire or stood slightly to one side when the blow landed. The impact penetrated the outer skull surface but failed to kill the individual immediately. Bone growth around the injury shows that Saint-Césaire survived for weeks or months afterward. The strike therefore occurred before death, but was not necessarily the cause of death. Survival also implies that the injured individual possessed sufficient strength, food, and perhaps assistance from companions during recovery. This combination of conflict and care captures the complexity of Neanderthal society more accurately than either the peaceful, primitive, or brutal, savage stereotype. Neanderthals could inflict serious injuries with weapons, yet injured members could also survive long enough for substantial healing. The archaeological setting places this episode near the disappearance of Neanderthals from Western Europe. The Châtel-Perronian Association initially suggested that Saint-Césaire belonged to a technologically innovative Neanderthal community living alongside expanding Homo sapiens groups. Later reassessment found mixing inside the archaeological layer and challenged the certainty that the skeleton and Châtel-Perronian tools belong together. Other research, including direct dating and evidence from the Grotte du Rhin, continues to support a Neanderthal connection with the Châtel-Perronian more broadly. Saint-Césaire consequently sits at the center of an unresolved argument over who created these tools and how closely the two populations interacted. The traumatic injury cannot identify the attacker. Another Neanderthal could have delivered the strike during conflict within or between local communities. An incoming Homo sapiens individual or someone belonging to an already mixed group also fits the wider circumstances. What the skull establishes is that serious armed conflict occurred during the life of this late Neanderthal. Combined with the disputed Châtel-Perronian setting, Saint-Césaire offers a rare glimpse of a European frontier where technology, ancestry, cultural identity, and hostility no longer followed simple biological boundaries. The absence of Neanderthal mitochondrial lineages among living people fits this broad framework, but it cannot settle it. Genetic drift can eliminate maternal lineages, especially when populations are small. Natural selection can also remove ancestry that creates harmful interactions. Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA could have survived briefly before disappearing, and the skeletal sample from the critical transition is painfully small. Yet surviving nuclear ancestry tells only the history of successful descendants. It excludes every hybrid community that vanished, every child without descendants, and every lineage lost during later population turnover. Some of the earliest Homo sapiens individuals in Europe carried recent Neanderthal ancestors but contributed little to later Europeans. Their existence proves that interbreeding was more common and geographically complicated than modern genomes alone suggest. Genetics, therefore, gives us a filtered inheritance, not a complete census of encounters. The new genetic survey of late Neanderthals in Belgium and France deepens the mystery. These communities were not universally trapped in tiny, closely related family groups. Many individuals across the Meuse Basin shared regional connections, yet they lacked the extreme mating among near relatives documented in some eastern Neanderthal groups. Their genetic burden did not steadily deteriorate toward extinction. This weakens explanations based upon simple biological failure. At the same time, none of the 16 Neanderthals younger than 50,000 years with usable nuclear data carries a clearly recent Homo sapiens ancestor, while every sampled Homo sapiens individual older than 40,000 years in Eurasia carries Neanderthal ancestry, and several had a Neanderthal ancestor only 4 to 10 generations earlier. The sample is small, but its asymmetry is striking. Neanderthals entered Homo sapiens family histories far more clearly than Homo sapiens entered the sampled late Neanderthal family histories. This is where assimilation and replacement become the same process. Neanderthal men who fathered children with Homo sapiens women did not preserve a Neanderthal population merely because their genes survived. Their children could enter expanding communities, inherit Homo sapiens maternal lines, and eventually carry only scattered portions of Neanderthal ancestry. Meanwhile, Neanderthal women who died, lost reproductive opportunities, or belonged to defeated groups left fewer descendants. Over time, the population called Neanderthal disappeared, even while some Neanderthal fathers became ancestors of later humanity. Biological continuity existed inside political and demographic replacement. The familiar statistic that people outside Africa carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA therefore conceals a harsher possibility. That ancestry could represent the residue of an unequal frontier rather than evidence of a gentle merger. Archaeology currently offers nothing that identifies Homo sapiens as the killers at Goyette. The people who processed those bodies could have been Neanderthals defending territory against unfamiliar Neanderthals, and eating outsiders already formed part of Neanderthal behavior long before the final transition. A mixed group also fits the known facts. The strongest argument, therefore, comes not from assigning guilt, but from recognizing the social world required by the evidence. Non-local women and younger people were selectively processed during an interval of population movement. Interbreeding followed a strong directional bias toward Neanderthal fathers and Homo sapiens mothers. Early mixed populations repeatedly vanished. Neanderthal communities differed genetically and culturally across surprisingly short distances. Together, these facts describe a fragmented human landscape in which reproductive success, mobility, alliance, and conflict determined which identities survived. The final replacement, therefore, looks less like one species defeating another and more like a prolonged struggle among overlapping human communities. Archaic Neanderthal groups, incoming Homo sapiens bands, and mixed descendants all occupied the same broad world. Some exchanged tools and partners. Some attacked outsiders, some absorbed survivors from broken communities, some disappeared so completely that neither fossils nor modern DNA preserve their story. Across perhaps several thousand years, the frontier shifted from the eastern Mediterranean into Europe and from one valley to another, producing neither a single battlefield nor a single moment of extinction. Its outcome appeared only after generations had passed. Neanderthal communities were gone. Neanderthal maternal lineages were gone, yet portions of Neanderthal fathers endured inside populations increasingly identified as Homo sapiens. At Goyat, the broken bones of women and children offer one narrow opening into that hidden process. They cannot tell us the ancestry of the people holding the stone tools, the language spoken inside the cavern, or whether the encounter began as a raid, an execution, or a struggle between rival groups. They tell us that outsiders were selected, that female bodies dominated the assemblage, and that the final Neanderthal world included human predation at the very time new populations were approaching. Genetics supplies the opposite trace, showing Neanderthal men crossing into Homo sapiens ancestry with unusual frequency. Between those two lines of evidence lies a possibility that deserves serious attention. Neanderthal women were progressively removed from the reproductive landscape, while Neanderthal men were assimilated, leaving descendants but losing their communities. Thank you for watching.